Now, meanwhile, admitting more people. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. So Dylan, we'll hear a bit of an intro from Dylan, right? So Dylan, Todd, I, and also Anthony worked on this bill in Montana, which we think creates a lot of new opportunities. And then after Dylan, I will talk a bit about how it looks kind of more on the technical basis, what opportunities that opens, and then we can kind of have a conversation how that can be relevant for you and for your business. Right, so we want to really use this call to leave a lot of time for questions and to see that it can be something that you can benefit from. Dylan, want to get us started?
Sure, yeah. So I'll kind of give you all the background. I kind of started this push in Montana back in 2023 with SB422. And what SB422 does is it expands eligibility under the Right to Try Act. And so for those of you that don't know, Right to Try was a law passed, I believe in 2017 or 18 by the Trump administration. It started out in the States and it ultimately, I think, was adopted by 48 states before it became federal law. The idea behind it is if you are a terminally ill patient, you have the right to try a therapeutic that has not been fully approved by FDA. I took a look at this bill and saw a lot of potential. Specifically for our longevity community here. I think a lot of people in the longevity community don't really want to wait until they are terminally ill in order to, maintain their health. And so I worked with State Senator Ken Bogner, who I met at a conference. Ken is a pioneer, really a trailblazer. In this, endeavor, really taking the lead here for medical autonomy and patient choice. And we worked on SB 422 throughout 2023. It passed the House and the Senate pretty easily. There was not any pushback. I believe the final totals were about 80-20 in the House and 40-10 in the Senate. So SB 422 made it without much issue. And then, the law went into effect October 2023, and I was expecting a flood of people to enter the Montana market to sort of offer these next generation therapeutics. Just to go back, actually, I skipped one part. So the differentiation between 422 and the federal right to try law is that patients in Montana under 422 have the right to try a therapeutic regardless of their health status, with the one being that they, the drug has to be past phase 1. And so that phase 1 requirement gives us a nice blanket of safety to protect against any adverse effects in the short term. And it opens up the opportunity for real world data to be generated from therapeutic administration. So that's the goal with 422. And I was expecting a flood of people to rush to Montana to sort of take advantage of this new ecosystem, this new regulatory landscape, but it didn't really happen. And the main reason it didn't happen, and I talked with Nick and Todd and a bunch of our other sponsors over at A4LI, is because there was a lack of clarity around provider requirements, doctor licensure, things of that nature, the sort of operational aspects of 422. And so Nick and Anthony and Todd and I and a few other LI team put our heads together and sort of figured out how we could actually operationalize and make good on 422, and that's where SB535 came in. So we got that process started in about January, February of this year. It was quite a sprint to get it passed. We started a little late in the cycle, but we got it done anyways. SB535 was a little bit more of a treacherous road to get past. I see Todd smiling, and I think we all had our worries there, but it passed the Senate in the first reading, 40-10. It passed the House by a vote, by one vote in the first read in the House, and then it went back to the Senate and passed by about 10 votes. So there was a little more controversy here. I think it's something to be aware of for everybody entering this space, that longevity is still not a mainstream topic. And, that's part of the work that we do at A4LI, is to make this mainstream in biotech research and consumer minds. But it's still not, widely accepted. Right. And so we're pushing the frontier here. And, everybody on this call, think of yourselves as trailblazers alongside the Infinita SB4LI team, because that's what you are. We're looking to reimagine how we do drug regulation and drug development in the U.S., expedite it, accelerate it, to give patients and give customers the best opportunity to live long, healthy lives. So with that all being said, we got it passed. It was signed by the governor May 15th, I believe. And now we're at the point where we're working with the Department of Public Health and Human Services to adopt administrative rules. And so that process should be done by the end of the summer. And once that's done, I think we're looking at a fully operationalized Montana ecosystem for expedited and accelerated drug development and patient access. So very exciting times. I hope you guys are as excited as we are. I'm looking at all of you and looking at the change makers in this call right now as the people that are going to make good on the regulatory landscape that we've put in place in Montana.
Great. Thank you, Dylan.
Nope. I can't really hear you, Nick.
You can't hear me? What about everyone else?
Good.
Yeah, okay, good. Right, so I made you and Todd co-hosts, so if there's any new people coming in while I talk, I think you can admit them. Right, so I'm gonna give about a 10-minute talk as well. You should see my screen now, right? So to provide a bit of background as to what we're doing with Montana, right? So I was kind of convinced I need to build a company that introduces new regulatory pathways for longevity therapies, right? And go a bit into that why. So, with Infinita City, we already have a physical hub in Prospera, the startup city in Honduras. Many of you have quite a bit of context or background on Prospera. Some of you might be new to it, right? So at a different point, I'll get to it. But we have a couple of startups here. We've raised more than 30 million in funding for these startups, and we have a permanent community here on site. And it's a very great location on Roatan on a beautiful island. And our goal broadly is to make this on the left side into this on the right side. So on the right side is an acceleration curve, and on the left side, we'll get to that in a second what that is. By the way, during my talk, feel free to write down questions in the chat, right? Because sometimes you probably have a thought in your head, it's some like slide. So we remember in the Q&A if you put it in the chat. But yeah, what is this here on the left side? I think the chart on the left side is a problem. And it's what you probably heard of many times, Eroom's law, the reverse of Moore's law, right? So it describes how the costs for drug development have increased, right? So for 1 billion in R&D spent, you were able to get 100 new drugs and treatments, and now that's less than 1. And there's of course like more inherent reason and like science and all of that, right? So it's not only regulatory, but I do think that regulatory is a big part of it, right? Due to many different reasons. And I'm happy to go into in detail, right? And after all, it's of course up to us if we to show that we can do something different. But I think most importantly, for people in this audience, it's kind of an existential threat to longevity, right? So in the process of working on the laws in Montana, I kind of realized how much the sick care system idea is kind of ingrained in law, right? So, it's all about treating clinical endpoints and things like that. And, part of it is of course good, but why shouldn't you have the flexibility? And, in longevity medicine, we're convinced that we can have a bit more of a preventative approach to make these diseases not happen in the first place. And that's kind of very difficult to fit within the existing regulatory categories. But on the other hand, I also found that that's an opportunity, right? Because the longevity industry was kind of from the beginning looking to do something different. Because they kind of realized, okay, we might not be able to do what we're trying to do here in our lifetime. And just to bring the message home, right, because lots of you have heard about Eroom's law, and we can debate what is the real reasons for it. But I think now there's a bit of more urgent data to point at that biotech investment now, or pharmaceutical R&D now, has returns below the cost of capital. That's just like in the last 15 years. And that's not good, right? It's not a good situation to be in, right? So So it's something we should there's definitely something not to ignore, right? So, there's still individual biotech companies and new therapies and drugs that we can get to market. But I think for the industry as a whole, that is a very big problem. So tackling the systematic issues could be or should be worth the thing we're trying. And as a result, also the third of external molecules are now licensed from Chinese biotechs, right? And if anyone is wondering why that is, there's a very interesting article that describes how that was actually due to deregulation, right? So the number of days for new IND approvals in China went down from 1,000 days to like 40 days. Right? So that is a very important lever to change things. So let's think about how to do that in the United States and in the Western world as well, where there's still the largest capital markets for biotech and still the largest consumer market. Right, and solution space, the kinds of things I was looking at and also others are looking at is doing trials in Australia, for example, where they're much cheaper. Bahamas recently passed a new longevity law. I've been in Prospera for more than 3 years, right? We got a few companies there like Mini Circles and Bind Labs and Unlimited Bio. So I think still very high long-term upside. So I'm native here. I live in Prospera. So to me, it's the most high upside jurisdiction in the world. But at the same time, we kind of were facing this problem, right? So it's still very far away from being legitimized and being sort of a credible biotech and healthcare hub, right? So it's just still a bit too far outside of the Overton window in many ways. I mean, we have made very important progress. So I think we're getting closer. But the question I just always get is, okay, I build a company here, I do a clinical trial, I have some patients, but then how do I get into the United States? Right. So, and also like the political uncertainty definitely doesn't make it easier. So, and of course, like getting in access in the United States, it's the largest consumer market in the world. So it's necessary to think how we could do that long term. And, we're kind of hoping, hey, maybe the FDA accepts trial data here that would make it easier for others to accept as well. Or that would sort of be a good advantage for the companies here. But yeah, then we realized, okay, that's not enough to just wait for the FDA to accept it. We were finding out about a new pathway, and that's where we get to Montana. Right. So Montana, as Dylan described, already had a right to try law for 22. And it's different from all other right to try laws in that it's really broadens patient eligibility. Every patient is eligible under right to try. And that is enormous, right? Before, only terminally ill patients would qualify. And you know what that kind of means for the incentives for biotechs, right? So when you give someone a drug who is, terminally ill or might die, like, did they die from the drug or did they die from natural causes? You have to report it anyway. And that can be a risk to like your trial, right? So there's just not a very strong incentives for biotechs and for providers to work with that law. And consequently, it's hardly used, right? So compassionate use is much more widely used. It has several thousands of users, but right to try, I found different sources, only 4 patients were treated with it. Another source said 10, another said 16. So that's not a lot, right? But Montana had this law and it makes it compatible, especially with longevity, thanks to Dylan and thanks to Ken Bogner. And it is also an attractive destination in many ways. So we kind of did a deeper analysis based on a lot of feedback. The way I describe what we did with this law basically is to reduce the risk for providers and increase the upside, right? So there was still a lot of risk. Like due to like liability issues and also who do you report to, and also just a lot of legal cost and regulatory cost, right? Because you need to work with the clinic, you need to work with an insurance, you need to make sure that you really understand all the reporting requirements. You need to have a Montana licensed doctor and whatever. And then it's just like there's not clear rules as to how you can exactly do that. And as you know, there's many state and federal conflicts. So with this new law, we were really streamlining all of that, right? So here's like a very clear pathway, right? So the law explicitly says kind of what's possible. and what kind of what's the exact pathway. And then it increases the market size and increases the opportunity size, right? So we were kind of able to insert language also in that allows, for example, to reciprocate other regulators, right? So if it's allowed already in Japan or in Europe, then you can use that safety data in Montana, right? So it doesn't have to be an FDA phase 1 trial. It has to just be equivalent to an FDA phase 1 trial, and in terms of the requirements on the regulator. So I think that's something very big that really increases the market's size, and really allows international providers to get market entry for therapies and drugs that already have a long safety and efficacy track record elsewhere. By the way, I don't think necessarily that's super new. In my reading, that was already possible on the federal right to try. But again, here just we made it very explicit that there's a pathway, right? And then finally, I always saw or was very hopeful that this could be sort of a more direct to patient pipeline, right? So, and it's not necessarily that there is fewer protections of patients. In fact, there might be more protections, right? Because we have stricter informed consent requirements, right? So you do an interactive video verification of like the comprehension of the patient and whether they understand the risk, right? But at the same time, we're removing sort of requirements to have like an insurance in between, for example. So this makes pay out of pocket arrangements and direct agreements possible, which, as you know, is otherwise very, very difficult. I mean, there's all these intermediaries and middlemen otherwise. And finally, I think it's also a good thing that we found a model where the state also gets revenue from it that's directly funneled to Montana residents with medical needs, which I think also increased the bipartisan appeal of the bill. And to talk about like the key element of the legislation that's novel, and this is kind of where that could be relevant for you to how you dock in, right? So the key unlock we wanted to design with this law is, so right now, this is kind of when the legal fixed costs, if you want to enter the market, right? So there's a lot to figure out, a lot of contracting, a lot of reporting, and a lot of sort of, you need to understand what are the limitations of like manufacturing and where do you like, how do you not step on like federal and state conflicts and things like that. So right now, everyone would kind of be on their own, and you'd be on your own if you go into Montana, right? But with this new law, we introduced this new category of experimental treatment center, right? And it is kind of the category of a clinic in the law, but the actual, and you could use it like that, but the actual idea is that this experimental treatment center kind of makes the market entry easier for more providers by giving them like a very clear legal framework. Hey, we've already thought of everything. Here is a contract, and here's like the liability, right? Here's like the liability framework for it. These are the conditions under which you can treat patients or collect data, right? So these are the requirements we need to follow. Here's like all the safety stuff. And then the experimental treatment center has oversight, right? So they're responsible for like the safety and oversight legal requirements under Montana law. And they then report to the Department of Health and Human Services, right? So this then reduces the fixed costs for any of the individual providers to do all of that. Like all of that can be bundled with the experimental treatment centers. And this then makes it a scalable model, right? So any experimental treatment center could probably have like a couple of dozens of providers that they work with, whether that's clinics or whether that's who directly to patients, or whether that's biotechs who want to collect more data or make their treatments available. And they would be then the one that have the oversight of the Montana Department of Health and Human Services, right? So we made sure that some of these oversight mechanisms kind of are robust enough to withstand questioning or scrutiny. Like it's pretty much in most ways the same as the FDA would do it, right? So it's like, how adverse event reporting, the whole manufacturing requirements and like informed consent and all of that. So all of that is partly in the bill and partly is now kind of, there's an important dependency now, right? So the bill was kind of the right skeleton, but now we need to kind of put meat on the bone, right? So it's still an important phase where we're looking for clarity from the department. Like we, of course, like have some ideas of what we need, right? So we're seeking kind of an active dialogue with the Department of Health and Human Services to sort out these exact detailed questions. Like, for example, we want to introduce things like scientific review boards, which basically have the approval authority over new therapies and basically assess the safety data and the efficacy data, and then basically report to the department. And that each of these centers needs such a scientific review board, right? So, so these are the kind of things that are still in the making. It will probably take another like 3 to 6 months, right? So, and in the meantime, we want to use that time to collect sort of more feedback from different providers, be it clinics or biotechs mostly, like you guys in the audience in the room here. And we want to, we with Infinita, we want to be the first experimental treatment center and kind of make the market entry easier for many of you, like maybe already next year or in the future. But really kind of start small and with a small small coalition, aiming to treat something like 100 patients next year, right? So start thinking small and really get that initial cohort right. Sort of select therapies or drugs that we know work. We can all agree among us, and sort of a scientific review board that we'd form could agree that this works and this is safe, right? And it has like a high patient impact. So the inevitable kind of PR rollout that will come with it would be favorable to the longevity industry. And we can say, hey, we're doing it the proper way and in a very rigorous way. But that is currently the plan with all of this, right? And that would, in our case, lead us to have sort of this dual hub model between Prospera and Montana. And for any of you who hasn't been to Prospera, you can visit us in September. But I want to stop it here and actually open it up for questions and Q&A. So Luis, is there?
Hello. One question I had is about manufacturing. So as I understand it, maybe this is wrong, so I wanted clarification. The manufacturing of the drug product has to happen in Montana, right? Regardless of whether it's molecule, cell therapy, but it has to be in Montana. That's first part of the question. Second part is that how much of the manufacturing has to happen there? Like if you, let's say, API manufacturing in China and then encapsulation or formulation in Montana, does it count?
Yeah. Todd, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so to your point, the manufacturing is supposed to happen within Montana, but one of the things that we're looking at and we believe is quite possible, for example, there aren't a lot of CDMOs in Montana. So, but there is an option to have a majority of the manufacturing done at another facility, say Washington State or someplace with a CDMO, and then do the fill and finish in state. And there is some exemption requirements that may be required, an exemption permit to allow that to happen. But yes, there will have to be some level of manufacturing within Montana, but some of it can be done out of state and then brought in for things like fill and finish.
And so is that driven by, let's say, trying to circumvent like the interstate, like FDA authority, or is it more like Montana wants manufacturing to happen in Montana, maybe for tax reasons?
So I think the answer is today, because there's not a lot of manufacturing facilities. I mean, you can do some limited manufacturing even in a hospital, depending on the nature of the treatment. But currently, a lot of biologics and things like that, while you might be able to do that in state, you might do a lot of it out of state and just bring it in for fill and finish.
Yeah. And in addition to that, I think there's also good opportunity for Montana. So it seems to me that there's not many states that have their own manufacturing regulations, but there's some. There's Idaho and Texas. And as some of you might know, there's countries like Australia, which have kind of leaner manufacturing regulations. Even the FDA is kind of exempting some phase 1 trials from like the heavy GMP right? So you can adopt the leaner version of that. So I think Montana really has an opportunity, and I hope they are interested in that, to develop kind of a sort of modern manufacturing framework that is sort of taking some of these best practices of Texas and Idaho and like Australia. And that could really make manufacturing in Montana tremendously attractive. By the way, when they say that, also, if any of you is, by the way, has experience in manufacturing or in manufacturing regulations, that's something that we're kind of very keenly looking for to get feedback on some of our ideas and what we can propose to the department.
Have you spoken to any insurance carriers or about paying?
Not really. I mean, we
lost you, Nicholas.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. You hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have not really spoken to insurance carriers, right? So we make the law so it's possible to pay out of pocket, right? Because that makes it, much more flexible in the beginning, right? The insurers will have to be convinced, right? And you have to explain to them the whole new pathway, and they have to kind of accept your regulatory mechanism, through the scientific review boards. So the view was, okay, that's a process we just don't want to depend on or rely on, right? So we want to make pay out of pocket possible. But of course, the more credibility this model develops, right, the more we can then also go to the insurers, especially if we have good data that, hey, this is something that you should also cover.
I have a second question. So the FDA did have a lawsuit in trying to take oversight over the clear industry, which they weren't successful. Do you expect or think that there could be legal action by the FDA trying to get federal oversight over this?
Yeah. I mean, it's something that, okay, for some reason you lose me just the first second. You hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Steve, feel free to add anything to that. Of course, this is something that in this kind of area is something to have on your radar. But at the same time, the current administration, at least in the FDA, we perceive as very friendly to us. Many of them actively have the same ideas that we have. At the same time, the moral argument for right to try seems to me is kind of one, right? It has very large support. It has the federal law, right? And also sort of the arguments that the FDA would have to make is sort of we're working with the state's rights approach, right? So we kind of make sure that the regulations have very clear language. This is medical services, which is regulated by the state, and this is drug development, which is regulated by the FDA, right? So we made very sure that there's not there's not a lot of reason for the FDA kind of to see this as something that would, so it's designed sort of to have that very clear distinction, so robust for the future. Steve, is anything you want to add to that?
Sure. What I add is we're currently looking into some of the specific implementation details that might be taken into account in order to reduce the likelihood of FDA litigation or just raising flags with the FDA generally. So there may be some things like Todd already touched on, the necessity to do a lot of manufacturing in state. I personally think there's probably going to be some things we need to keep in mind with not advertising in any way that goes out of state either. But that is something we're not going to have for probably another month or so, a fully fleshed out legal report. I will echo what Nick said though, or Nicholas said there. The current administration is the one, it's not the exact same one, but it is the same president who passed the original right to try law. It is certainly a right to try friendly administration. And, even if you were to imagine a world where the FDA was going to start trying to crack down on some of these state healthcare regimes, not only are they going to be facing a coalition of a lot of well-moneyed and powerful legal interests, but there's also lower hanging fruit like the Utah or Florida stem cell laws, which in my opinion are a much more direct shot across the bow of the FDA. I think you can reasonably foresee a base case of enforcement discretion. And I also do think that there's ways to do this in a fashion that is probably not even putting it into interstate commerce clause territory. What exactly that is, we're just not quite at that point yet, but we should know within the next 30 days or so.
Let me ask you on a different risk situation. Do you have, or you're working on language that the patient would sign, that they, understand that they're taking the risk? They're not going to then turn around if, they die or something happens, that they sue sue everybody involved.
Yeah. So there's some like very specific requirements.
Lost you again, Nicholas.
Weird. So yeah, so we actively, so the law has the requirements when it comes to informed consent, and there's some liability protections for the providers under that law, right? So which we do think are very strong. And in addition, we also put some additional provisions in place, like that informed consent should be like ideally recorded per video conversation, right? So that informed consent process is kind of also more auditable, it's kind of stronger or stricter than just like signing a bunch of forms, which are typically like 25 or 30 pages long. So we think that that can be like a very robust process there.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a question before by Liz. So Liz, for Dylan, but he's left, so I can also answer that. Liz asked, what's the difference between the first law and the updated version? I'm sure it's already answered, but just like in brief, yeah, the first law really was the longevity law, which broadened patient eligibility, but it wasn't like systematically addressing some of the business issues and sort of creating a clear like a regulatory pathway. So the new law is really creating that regulatory pathway, sort of clearing, okay, what's the explicit pathway, like through the experimental treatment center and things like that. Then we have questions by F. Leon and then by Greg.
Hi, thank you. Francisco Leon, I'm the CEO of a company called Tolerance Bio, and we are developing a therapy to preserve the thymus, the organ that keeps the immune system young and disappears over time. Is the reason for the loss of health span. So my question is about manufacturing. Maybe I missed it, but I thought in the updated law, the requirement for manufacturing in Montana had been removed, but maybe I'm mistaken.
So yeah, so in the actual SB535 itself, it is not specifically in there, but it'll be covered in the rules making. So what is required, of course, the department has ultimate say in what the rules are, and that includes what are the requirements for manufacturing, what has to be manufactured to what specification, etc. So you'll see that when that comes out of the rulemaking.
So eventually the expectation is you do need to manufacture in Montana.
You do, but again, as I said initially, you may, because of the lack of facilities in Montana, depending on the nature of it, you may be able to do a portion of it outside of the state and then do things like fill and finish inside of the state.
Right. Understood. Thank you very much, and thanks for organizing. This is very interesting.
Thanks.
So I'll add. So we're working on a trial right now in Australia, and we make that argument that they don't have the ability in Australia for antibody conjugation, for example. But you could you can get an Australian company and they transact with an overseas company. So it's still using the revenue within. So I wonder if that framework in Montana could be sort of like, okay, you don't have it, but we'll hire this Montana company and they'll contract.
That's one of the things we're looking at.
Yeah.
And Greg had a question, raised his hand.
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas, for setting this up and everybody else on the call. For myself and for a couple of folks here who are in Montana and get a lot of questions from companies outside Montana, some of which are on this call. I directly get, hey, I have a phase 2 ready drug, or I have a longevity product. I'm ready to go. This law is great for me. What do I do to get into Montana? And I think the answer to that question, Nicholas, maybe I defer to you and others on the call. I think we're all discussing, or you're discussing, being the destination for that question, or the answer to that question, but others too. So at the moment, how is that question answered?
Yeah. So again, my idea with this law was that we have experimental treatment centers that can be sort of the gateway for individual clinics and biotechs to use their framework to enter the state, right? So, and we'd be one of the first ones. But of course, anyone else can also set up these experimental treatment centers, right? So, happy to advise, right? I mean, our initial target market is longevity, right? So, that's the area where I'd like to, that's the business that I focus on. But of course, like there could also be experimental treatment centers for rare diseases, right? Or for cancer and oncology. So it's really a wide open field. And sort of between us, including, some people in this call, we want to put together and kind of an alliance like Montana 535 that really puts that information out there transparently, right? So that is answering some of these questions that give a pathway how anyone can set up an experimental treatment center and who are kind of the to-go people that can help advise on that, sort of in whether the relevant context, like in the department and then the legislature and things like that.
Great. Yeah, thanks. No, it's it's great that this is happening and we're all having a lot of conversations. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Sir, Jose?
Just another question I have about advertising. So I was thinking, so we have this at Retro, this iPSC-derived HSC therapy that ideally we want to give eventually to healthy people to boost their immune system. And so we will do a phase 1, let's say, in diseased patients with blood disorders, and we'll have phase 1 safety data, which would enable us to potentially try this in Montana for healthy patients that want to try it. But then to let them know that the therapy exists, sometimes there can be like limitations legally on how much you can advertise. Like, for example, maybe you cannot advertise out of state. So maybe you cannot advertise online. So do you have any guidance on how to let people know in Montana that they have access to this therapy?
Yeah. It's my understanding, and maybe Steve or Todd correct me if there's some nuance to that. So in Montana, as far as I know, that works. Like, I'm not a legal expert, don't quote me on that, right? But within Montana, I see us operating kind of under the state framework, right? So under medical services, right? But don't quote me on that, right? So because there is also federal regulation where I think the terms are sometimes a bit ambiguous. But last time I checked, I think it was fine, right? So you can't do it if it's like under a clinical trial or something like that. Or there's some caveats. But I do think we can. And then the other thing is, I do think you can advertise through channel partners, like if it's not you directly or the provider. Steve or Todd, do you have any additional insight on that?
At this time, I would still be waiting for the feedback that we're going to be getting from the law firm. I will tell you that my biggest concern around this surrounds advertising that would be considered like interstate enough to start making something fall under the Interstate Commerce Clause. Again, I want to stress that what exactly that means, I'm not entirely clear on at this point. I do know, for example, we just looked at a law firm today that has successfully challenged the FDA in the past on freedom of speech issues, First Amendment basis. So, it might be that maybe something like focusing on content style advertising, podcast interviews, that kind of stuff is a good way to get a good network effect. But I really, in the same way Nicholas was saying that, I just want to say, take everything I'm saying right now with a grain of salt until we have the finalized report. I can't say for sure.
So how long is the time frame, you think, until you have everything signed off by the governor, legislature, everything could start? Are we talking in the summer, end of summer? Are we talking fall?
We're probably talking Q1 of next year. So
Q1 of next year.
Right. So there's the rules making portion. Once those rules making are done by the department, they will then be taken back up to the House and the Senate because they have to approve the rules. Once that is done, then we're going to actually get into the actual execution. So that's the actual process of issuing licenses and things like that. So estimating Q1 next year.
Exactly.
And to get the experimental treatment center, that's in that time frame and stuff like that.
Yeah. So Nicholas and I have been talking to some of the actual, providers, some of the medical providers in the state that could provide us the facilities, the actual bricks and mortar facilities and infrastructure to do some of that. So we're having some of those conversations.
Yep. Francisco, you raised your hand, or is that an old hand? Great. So that might be.
So one other question is so what is the hospital capability in Montana to administer the patients? You have to look at that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it was our impression that there is, or the feedback we got, that there's plenty of space available in existing healthcare provider networks, right? So space would not be so much of an issue. So we could rent or lease that. Yeah. But yeah, so that is kind of the gist of it, right? So there's still a rulemaking process continuing, and still some of the important fine-tuning and pathway will be decided there. So that's something to keep watching out for, right? So we got a lot of interest for this webinar, so we might do that a bit more regularly. So especially when there's updates on that process, right? And we also partly do it again to source some feedback and ideas, right? So if we can end this call, or what I can say, what we're looking for is definitely on the manufacturing side. So if there's anyone in the audience here who knows the regulatory side of that really well, or has worked in manufacturing themselves, that'd be very valuable to us right now, right? And also, we're kind of interested to, if you're interested in offering your therapies to patient there, we would kind of like to understand a bit what would be kind of the incentives or the upside for you, right? So we have this form. I'm going to post it here in the chat again, where we're sourcing or asking for biotechs and clinics to connect with us. And we're looking to interview you guys on sort of how exactly how much upside we'd have to create to make it worth your while, or sort of what would be something that you could imagine doing within the next couple of years. So this will be very important feedback for us, right? Because there's a couple of different pathways we can take, right? So are we working with providers from or biotechs from the United States that are in active trials, right? So looking to do a phase 2 or phase 3 trial, getting additional data, or are these providers who have existing therapies that they that this can give market access to within the United States, right? So these are all very important questions, and at the same time, we also kind of have to figure out, because as you heard before, the manufacturing is a crucial part, right? So what would be sort of the initial batch or set of therapies that we could offer that we can manufacture there, or that we can manufacture by using the exemption clauses that we were talking about, right? So these kind of detailed questions will be very, very important for us to figure out, right? So thanks everyone for coming to this webinar. And you can get in touch with me for sure, with Dylan, with Todd, with Greg also, right? So Greg is from Montana, from the Biotech Alliance there. So he also has a very large network in the state there. And yeah, I will follow up with you guys with some of the materials that are shared today. The recording we might leave in private mode for now, right? Because we're sort of talking or sort of still crafting the narrative when it comes to the public, right, and the journalists. So we don't yet want this to be like too widely talked about before like the department rules or whatever are in place, right? So of course you can share access to or share like the future webinars within like your trusted circles. But in the meantime, especially also because we still like need to build these relationships in Montana and kind of sort of assure them sort of our intentions and that we sort of do good stuff here in a very rigorous way. And as you know, there's sometimes like journalists that look out for hit pieces. So we want to be sort of treading carefully there, but we're comfortable in sharing all of these insights that we have already, and also the ones that we will collect within a trusted circle of other people like you. Right, so use this as an opportunity to work with some of us, or also use it to figure out how you could do it by yourself, right? Because this is law, this is a public good, and we think this has the best chance of succeeding if we're able to prove that this brings a lot of industry, a lot of business to Montana. I think that's the main thing. If we're able to prove that, then the stakeholders we work with so far, and Senator King Bogner, look good, right? And then we can also use that success to talk to other states to expand the right to try framework, and even at the federal level. Hey, this actually brings business, while at the same time, self kind of policing our space, right? So this is kind of an opportunity to do things that are currently not possible, right? So we have to do that with a lot of responsibility in mind, right? So we'll have things like the scientific review boards, and I think especially among sort of the legit players in this industry, we kind of need to be careful that we have the space very clean and have this done in a way that can be robust and justifiable to the public, maintains patient safety and all of that, and makes our stakeholders in Montana look good, right? Because ultimately this is then also about proving the longevity medical theory or the business theory behind it, right? So there can be a lot at stake there. So it's important that we get this right. So thanks everyone for being part of that, and looking forward to work with some of you in the future. Yes, Liz.
Oh, yeah. So I think that what we did in the Bahamas, that was worked on for over 2.5 years, would be a safe and effective, better route for Montana, rather than expanding the right to try. And so I just feel like we should get a group together and expand on the differences that would actually make a difference for Montana itself. Also, I'm worried about finishing a product in Montana. I think that actually that's a really bad idea. Montana should be accepting products and purification data from other states, because handling those products and doing anything to them on site then could actually increase the risk of contaminants and unseen effects in which manufacturers probably wouldn't want to be responsible for. And in the gene therapy space, there is nothing to finish on site. The product comes finished, and it's crucial that it is finished. So I think the only way that you could address that is by actually focusing on manufacturing over finishing a product on site. So yeah, I'd love to join the think tank on how to actually build a better platform for Montana, in which also would give access, going backwards and giving access to terminally ill patients with first in human. And I think that is, well, I know that is where the Bahamas is going to excel. They're going to be doing, we worked really hard on that, and it is emerging and going online now. And what's taken a minute is that it is designed with an ethics and scientific advisory board. So everything is built in, which is a benefit to the companies. It's also a benefit to the government, because the government has a whole line of defense before going into the study that everything has actually been observed. And by going back to terminally ill patients, it actually gives you the right to do first in human. And so it's basically considered a pre-regulatory path, which actually decouples it from the US FDA. And therefore, they don't have a reach into the law anymore, but it's a legitimate phase 1 clinical study. And what I'm worried about is that these pathways, like in the Bahamas, are just going to become more relevant to most companies that you and I and everybody else on here need to launch, because of course we need all companies to be successful to raise all ships, because we're not all doing the same thing, and we're going to need every part of thymus regeneration and muscle mass and telomeres and stem cell reprogramming and everything else that one company can't do to go forward together. And so if people are outfluxing to the Bahamas, it will be a legitimate phase 1, then they can come back to Montana, but in the meantime Montana starves. And of course, it would be an incentive for us to be in the United States and stay in the United States. And I don't think that the pre-regulatory route is actually a long pull for government. I think that actually it creates a legitimate onboarding for these type of therapeutics without being seen as being far out from safety and efficacy. As a matter of fact, it lines itself much more clearly, and it actually gives people a choice who are terminally ill to access potentially better medicine, who are going to die anyway. So I just implore us to think bigger and think outside of the box and the worry of the current system, whilst instituting something that is actually ethical and would be hard to pull down by the US FDA by any moral consequence.
Thanks, Liz. It's actually meaning or reminds me that I actually wanted to invite you on my podcast. So I would actually really like to learn more about the Bahama legislation. Are you open to that?
Sure thing.
Good. Yeah, you've been pioneering the space for a long time, so it'd be great to have that on. Great. Again, thanks everyone for coming. Karen just also posted a link on the symposium. That's great. So feel free to stay in touch with each other. I sent an email around, and including some of the materials. And yeah, let's rock and roll. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nicholas.
Bye-bye.